Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's accidentally been some ballot papers, but don't worry, I'm sure no one will notice. My name's Cory Hazelhurst, and my partner in viewing is Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Cory.
And this week we're talking about Election, the 1999 film starring Reese Witherspoon and Matthew Broderick. It's an American film about stolen elections. Doesn't sound like that's aged too well. In many of the lists, if you look online, as we did when trying to decide what was going to be in our opening season of top political films, Election features in them quite prominently. Also, it's called Election. Can't really get too much more political than elections. Had you seen it before?
No, which, if we have any regular listeners yet, is becoming a bit of a theme. I promise at some point we will get to something that I have watched before. And I should confess, I nearly watched the wrong election movie, because Election is also the title of a 2024 Indian romance, which features ballot papers, in my defence, and it opens with a quote from Abraham Lincoln. So you can see, in my defence, why I nearly went down completely the wrong track. This, however, is not the Indian 2024 romance.
Again, I don't think it's a podcast that we should do, but maybe a format that we could sell to an alternative podcast would be two different people watch films of the same name, but two completely different films, and then have a conversation.
Oh, that is a good format.
Feel free to credit us for that and our emerging media empire. And obviously, we're going to go through films with going through a series of categories. So this is the first one, Events, Dear Boy, in which we talk about our experience of the film and essentially try and give a brief synopsis of the plot. I had seen this film before, but it's one of those films that I'd basically forgotten almost everything about it. I remember enjoying it. I guess something else we're trying to work out as we do this podcast is how much spoilers to give away and how much of the plot to give away. And thought, well, let's be responsible podcast hosts. Let's see what the trailer of Election does. The Election trailer essentially gives away the ending of the film. Unlike, say, The Iron Lady, I would heartily recommend our listeners watch this film if you want to watch this. If you currently on iPlayer for 3 months, so if you're in the UK, you can watch this for free, and it's about 100 minutes long and is definitely worth your time. But we'll try and give you enough plot so that whatever conversation we're about to have makes sense.
If you haven't seen it, though, I think the ending is not wholly predictable. And we'll come on to the alternative endings as well. It's worth avoiding spoilers, I think, if you can, if you haven't seen it, or indeed have seen it so long ago you've completely forgotten it, because there is a little bit of drama about how it's going to play out. The trailer did remind me of Star Trek V, which was a really not very good Star Trek film, where the team who put together the trailer did a brilliant job by basically crafting a completely different and much better story for the trailer. Which meant having seen the trailer and being quite excited by the trailer, then going to see Star Trek V was quite a letdown. In this case, the actual film is much, much better than Star Trek V. But it does feel slightly similar, like the trailer is really a trailer for a different sort of movie in a way.
I think, as we'll probably come on to, the trailer bigs up all the things about this film that I think are quite irritating about the film's politics. Essentially, the plot that you need to know is Matthew Broderick plays Jim McAllister, who is a civics, ethics, current affairs teacher at a high school in Omaha. And he's in charge of the student body election. The front runner is Tracy Flick, who's played by Reese Witherspoon. And McAllister's taken against Tracy Flick, partly because she seems a bit like a kind of know-all, overachieving student, bit annoying. And also partly, and this is an incredibly dodgy sort of setup, I think, it's partly because a teacher colleague, a friend of his, had an affair with her and was consequently fired from his job as a teacher. Tracy's running unopposed to be president of the student body. What McAllister then does, he encourages Paul Metzler to run, who's a popular kid, he's sporty, but he's just had a skiing accident. So he's not able to do the sports he would like. So McAllister encourages him to run instead. Looks like it's going to be a two-way contest. What happens instead is Paul's sister Tammy enters the race, who's played by Jessica Campbell, essentially challenging Paul out of spite because Paul ends up in a relationship with her ex-girlfriend. The film is, on one hand, it's the student body election. On the other hand, it's the disintegration of Jim McAllister's life, who's the Matthew Broderick character. He has an affair with the ex-wife. of one of his friends, which destroys his marriage. Next category then is All the President's Men. Essentially, we talk about the cast and the crew. Matthew Broderick, as we said, plays Jim McAllister. And it's a bit of a poacher term gamekeeper, I guess, in this film, because Matthew Broderick, I guess, is best known for playing teenagers in high school comedies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and War Games. But in this one, plays a teacher rather than a student.
Yeah, although he plays a similar sort of somewhat lewd, unpleasant character, as I think he does in it. And in a way, that made me realise why I probably hadn't seen it, was that it is essentially a slightly crude American high school comedy in many ways, of the sort that obviously loads of people love, doesn't appeal to me at all. And I think that was probably what put me off going to see it at the time. And Broderick is an obvious, a very good, but in a way, obvious casting choice for that. It did, though, make me feel really old to realise, checking the dates, that prior to this film, he had already been the voice of Simba in The Lion King, which, given that I think Election is quite old, I think, my goodness, The Lion King is a very old film now. The other big star of the Election is Reese Witherspoon, and this was her basically breakthrough year, that she appeared in both Election and Cruel Intentions.
Just a few years before Legally Blonde as well, which I suppose is probably her best known role. Directed by Alexander Payne, he wrote Sideways, which is the wine film where there's lots of swearing about Merlot.
And a lovely little musical jingle on the DVD in between all the extras and so on, which I spent ages one summer trying to track down that jingle as anywhere else other than on the DVD.
And directed The Holdovers, probably one of the best Christmas films over the last couple of years. And also directed Nebraska, which was a black and white film that came out in 2013, I think. It has Bruce Dern in it. One of a big sort of Oscar bait type films, wasn't it, that came out? Again, as we'll talk about, I think this is a very well-made film.
It's got a very well-crafted screenplay, which was Oscar nominated, rightly, and very cleverly, as we'll come on to, interweaves different points of view of the characters. So at different points, different characters are narrating what's happening on screen. And in that sense, it's technically a very well constructed movie, isn't it?
It is. And I think what it does quite well is build up the Matthew Broderick, the Jim McAllister character, as someone who starts off the film talking about how he loves his job, he loves educating people, he's got this lovely wife. And essentially the film, in a way that I imagine the novel does as well, the film sort of chips away at that, and about how actually he probably isn't quite as successful as he feels. He probably is a bit more depressed than he's letting on.
I thought he was a bit of a unpleasant failure almost right from the beginning of the film, which is why, for me, in a way, that sort of that natural arc that you might expect of, good, honest person makes a mistake and everything horribly falls apart. That doesn't seem to be the story that his character goes through, which makes it a more interesting film in a way, but also as somewhat unsettling in terms of the moral lesson one might want to draw from the story. But I won't skip ahead to that.
Adapted from a novel by Tom Perotta, which I have to say I haven't read. A sequel published in 2022, and I believe there's talk of a sequel to this film in the works as well, where I think apparently Reese Witherspoon is reprising the role of Tracy Flick. Just to round off All the President's Men, you've mentioned American Pie, so Chris Klein plays Paul Metzler, who is the main challenger to Reese Witherspoon in the race. He plays Oz in American Pie. His sister Tammy is played by Jessica Campbell, who really sadly died in 2020, aged only 38. And she's very good in this film. Our next category then is the art of the possible. So are there any similarities between this film and real events? And I think there's two interesting illusions and one massive parallel. So interesting illusion number one, as you've said, one of the interesting things about the film comes from very many different narrative points of view. And the way the film deals with that is having different voiceovers at different points. And so you get Tracy's view about what this election campaign is. And there's a really interesting monologue in which she does that. And it's obvious from the monologue that Tracy sets up about this election is that for her, this election is very simple. The choice is between someone who has grown up in a working class household who's had to work hard every hour, every minute of every day. They've had to strive, done every paper. They've worked so hard to improve life as students of this school. So the choice essentially is between this hard-working, conscientious, but not really very clubbable working class candidate, whereas the opponent is a rich, lazy dilettante. Their dad has bought them a sports car, has laid it all out. The obvious parallel for me then is that this is essentially Richard Nixon against JFK in 1960. That's the parallel that I think in Tracy's mind this election is.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a good parallel because, of course, whilst Richard Nixon is notoriously the most problematic of that pair, with him being forced out of office, rightly so, JFK was not exactly a paragon of personal morality and virtue either, which I think is reflected in the film. I mean, I basically end up pretty much not liking any of the main characters. They all are unpleasant in their own different ways. The other obvious analogy, because two of the three candidates for president, two of them are brother and sister, is with the Milibands, the Ed and David Miliband. Although I'm being a little unfair in making that comparison to the Milibands, because I think they deported themselves in real life, again, rather better than any of the candidates do in the film.
And there's a scene in which Paul tries to get Tammy not to run and says, but you didn't tell me in advance that you were going to run.
Yes.
And that, to me, is the most direct parallel.
Very Miliband, that moment. Spookily so, given how many years earlier and in a different continent this film had its genesis.
And we just want to make sure there's no hard feelings there. And the echo is in that. The real parallel, so it's the one that was made at the time, and it's the one that was made much later, is essentially the parallel between Reese Witherspoon and Hillary Clinton.
I feel a bit uneasy about that parallel, although, as you say, it was the parallel that was made very widely when the film came out. For the parallel to work, you have to take a very derogatory, sexist view of Hillary Clinton. I don't know, who knows, maybe that was in part the intention either of the original author of the novel or the makers of the film, because obviously some people, indeed many people, have very negative views of Hillary Clinton. But the story of the film and the sort of critique of Hillary Clinton is essentially that for any woman to be successful in politics, they have to be heartless and ambitious and unpleasant. And so the parallel is there, but I'm not sure it's a parallel I would really want to buy into.
What's interesting reading up after the film is that Reese Witherspoon apparently in a Q&A later on is asked, will you ever play Hillary Clinton? She says, apparently reportedly, no, because I already played Hillary Clinton in Election. And Hillary Clinton, I think in Q&As, has said that Election is brought up a surprising amount of times as far as I can see.
The other parallel one could make is not that she's playing Hillary Clinton, but that she's playing Bill Clinton, because the character she's playing is of dubious personal sexual morality. You can see a parallel there. Bill Clinton, likewise, as with Richard Nixon, was the person made good up against a person sort of born into wealth and privilege, as Bill Clinton was. And also in the 1992 election, you have Ross Perot, this wild card third-party candidate who goes for an anti-political shtick, which is what we again get in the movie. So if one is going to draw a parallel between Reese Witherspoon and the Clintons, I think it is Mr. rather than Mrs. Clinton.
The film has a real contempt for career politicians as well. So there's lots of articles that come out in 2016. I think the parallel they're drawing there is essentially that Hillary Clinton comes across as this goody two-shoes, has done all the homework, has done all the facts, but can't really connect emotionally. Then Donald Trump is the son of inherited wealth who hasn't done the homework. I don't think that really works really as a parallel, partly because, as we'll go on to, I think the film has a very similar critique of both Tracy and Paul, but also because Paul Metzler is just a nicer character in the film than Donald Trump is. And I realise that's a horrendously low bar.
It's a very low bar.
So, for instance, Paul votes for Tracy, and there is no way on this earth that Donald Trump would ever decide that he was going to vote for his opponent, because he considered, well, I can't really vote for myself. I don't think self-effacing is part of Donald Trump's makeup. There are other adjectives you could use I don't really think that parallel works for me.
It's difficult to say something about Donald Trump that isn't controversial, but I think you have managed it by saying he's not self-effacing.
Come here for your bland political platitudes. Stay for the Phil Willis Award, our next category, because I think we've been dancing around this topic.
Mm.
And so our Phil Willis Award, who is the most evil or Machiavellian character in this film?
All of them. All of them. Every single one of them.
The really interesting issue for me about the film is that the film, for me, paints Tracy Flick as the worst character in this film. So the trailer makes this very explicit. The trailer is essentially Tracy Flick is a monster. Essentially says the reason why Matthew Broderick is trying to rig the election to stop her becoming president is partly because she's a bit of a know-all, but partly because he sees her as this kind of goody two-shoes overachiever who is going to grow up and become an absolute monster and therefore needs to be stopped.
Yeah, you see, but I just don't buy that morality tale. I think McAllister doesn't start off as being a particularly moral or sympathetic character, particularly the scene early in the film where it's clear his marriage isn't a happy one. Now, we don't know why, so, I shouldn't necessarily allocate blame to him for that. But it's not like he starts off the happily married person who gets led astray. What he decides to do, I mean, how much does getting elected president in a school election really matter? If you think somebody's a monster who might go on to do atrocious things in the rest of their life, it feels like stopping them becoming president in a school is about the smallest and weakest roadblock one could put in their ascent. And indeed may well actually worse, they may react to defeat early in their life by becoming all the more determined. You may end up worsening things. So this, for me, the morality tale doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons why I just think they're all awful.
I watched this film with my wife, who I think made the very astute observation that I'm going to steal. So the fact that Reese Witherspoon has had this affair with McAllister's friend essentially becomes a plot device that means that McAllister doesn't like Tracy Flick. And there's a really strange scene in which Tracy Flick is sort of leaning over Matthew Broderick in a car and saying, well, if I win the election, we're going to spend so much more time together. And again, there's this kind of weird, I think there's the idea that essentially she's leading him on and therefore led his friend on that makes her want to stop her. And I think for me, that should not be there and is unnecessary as a plot device. And especially now in Trump's America, you probably only need the fact that, well, we think she's a monster and therefore needs to be stopped. As you say, let's push the Richard Nixon comparison. If we assume that part of the reason why Richard Nixon engaged in a lot of the, let's just, again, if we're going to go with bland political platitudes, a lot of the shenanigans that the Richard Nixon White House went up to, part of the reason that happened is because Nixon felt that the 1960 election was stolen from him by, Lyndon Johnson in Texas or Mayor Daley's Chicago machine, whatever it is.
And he was probably right.
But therefore, the fact that you're going to steal an election from them very narrowly would probably make Tracy Flick worse. It doesn't work even on that level. I think the fact that the film wants you to see Tracy as the main villain, I think that's more a reflection of A, its contempt for career politicians, and B, its hatred and cynicism of the view of American politics in the 90s, which I guess we'll turn to. Now, I didn't think Tammy she's not evil. She's quite Machiavellian, I suppose, isn't she?
Yeah, I mean, Tammy seeks basically petty revenge, a sort of retribution for her ex's behaviour, enters the election as one way of carrying out that revenge, but then goes for this sort of uber populist, obviously meant to be slightly echoing Ross Perot at the time, but now we'd think of as echoing Nigel Farage or Donald Trump or Meloni in Italy, this sort of quite sort of right-wing populist, burn it all down, what's democracy good for, etc. message, which in a way is much more dangerous than some of the unpleasantness of some of the other characters, because she's a destroy the whole system. And now, having said that, you might think that I might have a nice word or two to say about Paul, because he's the poor victim in that sense of the teacher gets him to stand, his sister enters the election to also fight against him. But Paul is the sort of nice but a bit dim but sort of rich person and so on. But then he does have one or two quite unpleasant streaks to him. Near the end of the film, he says to Tammy, his sister, we're still brother and sister, even if you're adopted. So, as I said, I hate them all. They're all the Phil Willises of the.
Yeah, we're not even going to do a scale of evil. They're all bad. They're all
They're all
bad.
bad.
Okay, yeah.
And there is still one thing that is a slight shame, I think, in that there is an interesting aspect to Tracy's character about the loneliness of the successful leader. And that's something that lots of people who are good, decent human beings, who are successful leaders, often talk about as well, how lonely it can be at the top. And you get that outside politics as well as inside politics. And you do get a bit of that, coming through from Reese Witherspoon. I think she really shows her acting skill in drawing that out in a couple of scenes, but that's very much overshadowed. And I think it's hard to really make that case when the case is being made on behalf of, an unpleasant, manipulative character. It's a bit like the point that we made in our first episode about drawing out the humanity of a politician is a good thing to do. Quite hard to do it if you're using Margaret Thatcher as your vehicle to do it.
With Tracy, there are a few scenes, and again, I don't think this is a spoiler because it's in the trailer. There's a scene in which she tears all the election posters from the wall. It seems to imply that she's trying to manipulate Matthew Broderick. There's even a scene, I think, where she's almost blackmailing him. The point the film is making is most of the time Tracy is this sort of ideal student, always got a hand up, always very smartly dressed, always very articulate. I think, but has this dark underbelly, almost like Richard Nixon, one might say. But I think what the point the film seems to be making is that essentially this is a facade. Like the real Tracy is this dark underbelly that might come out. For me, the film wants you to think Matthew Broderick is doing the right thing by stopping Tracy. But as you've said, it's hard to see Matthew Broderick as a sympathetic character in this.
There's a moment where Matthew Broderick spills some food on the floor of the sort of communal kitchen area in the school and just ignores it. And this, without getting into spoilers, this turns out to be a little bit significant in terms of one of the developments of the plot. But just of the sort of little signs of whether someone's a decent human being or not, whether or not you pick up some litter that you dropped, that feels like that is meant to be quite symbolic. And that's another reason why, right from the beginning, because this happens near the start of the film, he's littering the floor, his marriage isn't happy, he's not, the happy hero whose life goes horribly astray.
I would agree, and I think that is intentionally significant. The Barack Obama's Tan Suit Award, this is where we talk about the best and worst bits of political detail we liked in the film. Do you want to kick us off?
The pens and the string. This nearly made me really warm to the film from early on, despite my views of all of the characters, because you have Tracy gathering the signatures for her nomination forms to run for president, and she has the nomination forms and pens, and the pens tied down by pieces of string so the pens don't go AWOL when people are signing the forms. Really good, genuine organisational tip for anyone who's getting signatures on a nomination form or signatures on a petition. Tie your pens down. That said, there are some dreadful details as well. And I will just jump in with one of them, which is the inspirational poster that's on the wall in the kitchen area where the food is spilt on the floor. And I quote, it says, "Climb high, climb far." Okay, so far, as inspirational posters go, then your goal, the sky, your aim, the stars. Now, if you're aiming for the stars, the sky's not your goal. The sky is you're basically barely your starting point. You've got to go way beyond the sky. If your goal is to get to the sky, you shouldn't be aiming for the stars, because then you'll be massively overshooting. It is just nonsense.
It seems like a terrible bastardization of the election pitch that Ricky Pym has when he's the Liberal candidate in A Perfect Spy, where at the end...
Good segue.
Where at the end of his peroration, I think, doesn't he say something like, "Ideals are like the stars, we can't reach them, but we are elevated by their presence." But again, it would have been very weird and not on brand for Tracy Flick to have Ricky Pym quoted on her bedroom wall. I think the interesting thing about the posters, all the quotes on Tracy's wall are very non-ideological. And I think that leans into something we'll talk about in a second, about how neither of the candidates are particularly ideological. that is quite vacuous. Two things I like about the sort of campaign material. One of them is it feels very much like a student election. So you've got all the, it reminded me of when we had student unions election at the University of Birmingham. And for about 2 weeks, you'd see all these handmade posters everywhere, which are hand painted with various different punning slogans. And I also like the fact that Tracy's got a nice badge that she's made herself with Pick Flick. And that feels like a very old-fashioned American, like Eisenhower's "I Like Ike." It does a lot of that machinery of politics, I think, quite well.
And there's the great moment where she talks about how to stick the posters on the wall properly, which very much feels like a proper student politics detail.
But also in dare one say it, proper elections as well, because when you get into a general election, you go to the campaign HQ and you've got 10 minutes. The job you will be given is to stick double-sided tape on posters. So that, because obviously a big no-no is do not give out posters that don't have tape on them, because otherwise they're never going to go in the window. Looking at my window now, I still can see the imprints of the double-sided tape from the Vote Al Khan's poster I had in the election 2 years ago.
Proper political organisers test out the double-sided sticky tape on their window before putting it on posters. But
it's a god tier level of political organising. The other detail I liked is, so Tracy comes from a single mother background. Again, there's this contrast with Paul. And her mum, I think, has worked herself up, hasn't she? She's become a paralegal. So she's always writing to strong women, including Connie Chung and Elizabeth Dole. I assumed that Elizabeth Dole was wife of Bob Dole, run for president against Bill Clinton in 96. I didn't realise Elizabeth Dole was a politician in her own right. So
yes, very much so.
Originally be part of the Lyndon Johnson administration, worked herself up, was in the cabinet, wasn't she, under Ronald Reagan? And there's a nice Roger Ebert review of Tracy Flick puts me in mind of Elizabeth Dole, who's a person who always seems to be presenting you with a logical puzzle for which she is the answer.
Which is exactly what a good candidate should do. There is one detail where I can reach for saying something nice about somebody in the film, which is the student who insists on following the counting rules properly for the election. Now, that is a proper hero.
A good segue, I think, into our next section, which is a very British coup. And are there conspiracy theories in this film?
Well, so I think there is, but I may be revealing a horrible ignorance or failure to follow something, because at one point, when Tracy is taunting Jim McAllister, she knows a lot of details about the state of his marriage and so on. And I didn't get how she knew quite so many intimate details about him at that point.
So my reading of that was...
She bugging his phone.
That would be very Richard Nixon behaviour, as it were. I think what's happening is, obviously, she's had this affair with Dave, who's McAllister's colleague. And what both of them seem to say is that this is not just a kind of physical thing. This is also a deep, sort of profound connection. And you get the impression they're also talking a lot. So my reading of that scene is that essentially it's pillow talk between her and McAllister and Dave, McAllister's colleague.
So that makes Dave seem worse as well, which fits with my general pattern of disliking everyone except for the election administrators in this movie. Okay, I'll buy that. No conspiracy required, just more unpleasantness.
I'm glad to have disappointed you further. The election rigging itself isn't really a conspiracy because, and I realise I'm going to sound like the spokesperson for, I don't know, say a certain White House administration or for a certain media company, that this was the action mark of one rogue teacher and does not represent the values of the high school and has been dealt with under internal disciplinary procedures. The sort of bigger overarching, I don't know if you call it a conspiracy theory, but this film has a very, very cynical view of American politics in the 90s. It's best emphasised by two things, I suppose. One of them is the student debate. Tracy's pitch is essentially, vote for me and I'll work hard and improve everything for you. It's very, very technocratic. Paul's pitch isn't delivered as well. In that sense, it's a bit of a reversal of the Kennedy-Nixon. You know, Paul doesn't come across well in this debate at all. Thing is, I'm a sportsman. I'll score a touchdown for you. I'll work hard. You know, I'll be a good mascot.
Although I do think it's a really good bit of acting, because to come over as somebody who is sort of messing up a public appearance is actually a very hard bit of acting to pull off. And I think that's done very convincingly, very well.
It's a bit like Tommy Cooper with magic, isn't it? You sort of have to know how to do the trick before you can then mess it up. That's a very hip reference for our younger listeners on TikTok. Ask your grandparents about Tommy Cooper. And Tammy's pitch essentially is, who cares about this stupid election? This election doesn't matter. Nothing will change as a result of it. It's completely pathetic. Everyone, pathetic promises. I don't care. I won't do anything. In fact, what I'll do is I'll dismantle the student government so we won't have elections at all. Rapturous applause. It seems like a real critique of the 90s view of democracy, in which essentially the two main parties are homogenous. They're not really talking about ideas. It's a very sort of technocratic, quite boring pitch. So I think you also see that with how McAllister talks about democracy. So when McAllister is explaining to Paul why he should run, and Paul's very much, well, Tracy seems to have this sewn up. And then Jim tries to explain democracy by saying, essentially comparing it to apples and oranges, isn't he? So you've got this choice, but in a very narrow range. It's a very cynical look at 90s democracy. And as you say, the energy of the film is with the Tammy view, which is, this is all a charade. It doesn't matter. The school, it's the higher forces. It's global capitalism, or it's the head teacher, or whoever it is, that are really running anything, and therefore it doesn't matter if we burn it down.
Given that you've mentioned apples and oranges, you're tempting me into a Romanian linguistic digression, because I quite agree with you. The phrase "you can't compare, apples and oranges" is a nonsense phrase, because they're both fruit. If I've got one apple and you've got 9,643 oranges, we can easily agree who has got the most fruit. You could absolutely compare them. The Romanian equivalent of the phrase, however, is grandmothers and machine guns. Now, that is a proper incomparable pair.
It's very Margaret Thatcher on a tank, isn't it? How to win an election. Given this is called election, given that you've literally written a book on how to win an election. So this category is about the best and worst bits of political strategy in the film. Yeah. Take it away.
Well, we've talked already a bit about Tammy's burn it all down speech at the hustings, which is very much the sort of Ross Perot populist outsider pitch, which she does really well. But what we also get in that hustings is that sort of almost like David Cameron TV election debate 2010 style of a regular recounting of different people and name dropping individual students in one of the hustings speeches, which again is now a very common political technique and is nicely caricatured. I guess also it's a bit of a double-edged sword as to whether Callister did he pick the right person to be the candidate? The right person to get to run the election. And recording this as we are in early 2026, while Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister. Who knows quite how that story will play out, but it's easy to imagine there may be some parallels between McAllister and Morgan McSweeney that people may draw in the future as to whether, it seemed like he got just the right candidate to back, but you know what? Turned out not to be such a good pick. But who knows? When Keir Starmer is winning his third landslide election in a row in a few years' time, and people are still listening to this podcast, I'll let you decide which of those two is the less plausible outcome. Maybe that analogy will not work at all.
If one was going to defend Morgan McSweeney, and I can't believe you've backed me into this corner, because this is not what I set up the podcast to do. You could argue, I guess, that Morgan McSweeney picks a candidate who will be able to appeal to the Labour members, yes, but then you can also sell to the country. In that sense, I think has done very well and does well at some of the aspects of being Prime Minister, particularly dealing with foreign affairs. You can see why Paul is picked. He's more popular and in a way is a little bit of an empty vessel. Dare one say it, Mark, you can get someone to drive the DLR train for him. Whether it's, his girlfriend writing his election slogans and speeches and what have you. Probably don't want to press those comparisons too much, but yes, pick your candidate. My political strategy point is taking the right or the wrong lessons from defeat. Tracy loses the election, obviously is very upset because of that, and her mum is sort of trying to console her and says, maybe you needed more posters, or maybe you should have listened to my suggestions about your
I
speech.
don't think she's consoling her when she says that. She's being an awful parent when she's saying that. She's basically saying you've lost because you didn't take enough of my advice.
I'm sure we can't think of any political consultants who's ever said that.
What's quite interesting about that comment from Tracy's mum, I mean, I think she does come over as a really bad mum in that moment, and she is misunderstanding why her daughter lost the election. But there is actually a little bit of virtue in what she says, in that, in general in a life, it's quite good advice to worry about the things that you've got some influence over. And that's advice that you might hear in, say, a business context, in a political context, even in, say, a mental health context. Often the basic advice is try and focus in on the things that you can do something about, because you can do something about them. And in a way, what Tracy's mum is saying is, well, here are some things that you could, you've got control over, that you could do differently in a future election. So although it's really badly timed and it seems to be given for the wrong reasons, maybe there is a bit of wisdom in that advice after all.
Post-mortem is good, but maybe wait a bit. If the candidate is sobbing in front of you, maybe wait to have your post-mortem done later. The next category is the zeitgeist tape. So we talk about any production details we quite liked. As we've said, I think this is a really well-made film. There's a few little Easter eggs that we can talk about. Any particular favourite bits of detail?
I guess 3 particularly favourite bits of detail for me. Number 1 is the boy dressed up as a nut early on. It's not really necessary, not really relevant to what's going on, but it's quite a fun moment to freeze frame and enjoy the costume. The second, which is much, much more substantive, is the use of multiple narrators. Different characters at different points of the film are narrating what's going on. And that's done technically in a really good way. It sort of flows very neatly. But the fact they're also often telling us things that are contradicted by what you see on screen is also bringing out the unreliable, egotistical nature of the narrations that we're hearing. And that's telling us something about the characters. But also this reflects the novel, which I hadn't realised until I was reading up about it, is like with Game of Thrones. The novel is a series of chapters told from different characters' first-person point of view. So that narrating structure quite neatly matches that of the novel. So I thought that was really clever. And then the third sort of production detail is the story about the ending. So the film, when it was originally made, the ending was screen tested, as is quite common for movies, and the screen test audiences didn't like the ending, and so a completely different ending was shot instead. Now, normally when you hear a story like this, it's followed up by just what a horrible, bland, saccharine actual ending was put on, and how the original ending is much better, and real fans of the film prefer the original ending. Complete opposite in this case. The original ending is dreadful. In this case, the screen testers were absolutely right at giving it a massive thumbs down, because as we talked about, this is a film of a large number of unpleasant characters. We might slightly disagree about how many of them are unpleasant, but large number of unpleasant characters doing unpleasant things. And the ending, as originally filmed, is just a rather saccharine, happy ending. And so the fact that was ditched, and it's actually, if you think about it, the ending that it replaced it with involves filming in a different city and so on. So they put a lot of effort into putting together a different ending, which is massively better. So the ending is definitely a highlight, which isn't quite as rude a comment about the film as it sounds. Oh, the end is the best bit, but the ending is definitely very well done.
For such a cynical film with such a cynical trailer, it really wouldn't work. A couple of small things I like. So some of the music is really good in the film. There's a section of music from an earlier Western in the poster ripping scene, which is quite fun. There's a bit of imagery in the film, isn't there? So we mentioned the comparison of democracy to apples and oranges. And there's a scene in which Matthew Broderick is stung by a bee. Not a spoiler, because it's in the trailer. They've got apple trees there that he takes, and I think he's about to commit adultery there. And I think there's a bit of a apples as forbidden fruit thing.
Yes, good, yeah,
going on there. As well as apples and oranges, I suppose the other sort of democracy is consumerism detail is about Coke and Pepsi. Tracy's talking to McAllister. Why is it that Coke are the number one soft drinks company in the world? It's because they do all this advertising. And then you see McAllister in the next scene drinking a can of Pepsi. In another scene, you see Tammy at the football field, and you can see on the scoreboard there's a Coke advert, and there's a few little kind of recurring motifs about that. The other thing I really liked, because it's a real window into the late 90s, and particularly about sort of social media and how memes worked before even the word meme was really a thing that people other than Richard Dawkins used, was that a story about the election rigging in Omaha sort of blew up. It was one of those "and finally" pieces that you'd have probably in the local press, the TV news. We're told it blew up because it was a sort of silly news story that you'd either email or post on a bulletin board at work. And that feels like a really interesting for our younger listeners on how you'd end up, it wouldn't go, now it would fly around WhatsApp groups, I suppose, be shared on Facebook. But I love the idea of work bulletin boards or email chains being used in such a way.
Yeah. One other detail, which is in the original ending, but is available online to watch, but was rightly junked for the film, is in the original ending, you discover that Tracy lives just down the road from the huge cement plant, which is the source of Paul's family's wealth. And it's done in a slightly ham-fisted way, the way that McAllister sort of looks from Tracy's house to the concrete plant and back again, as if to really drill the point home to the audience. There is a nice idea there that Tracy has grown up within sight of all of this wealth that other people have. But that's not quite enough to rescue not even close to being enough to rescue the awfulness of the original ending.
Speaking of endings, our final category, state of play. Would you recommend this film?
Essentially, I very quickly realised why I'd not watched it at the time. It's a sort of lewd teenager comedy style movie. But obviously lots of people do like that. That's fine if you like lewd teenage comedy and you like politics. This is a good film to go for. It's not put me off doing the podcast with you. It's not been that bad. On the other hand, films that I really like, I would be scrambling to get hold of the novel. I would be getting hold of the sequel to the novel. The book has been published. I would be setting up a Google News alert for news about whether the sequel is going to be turned into a film, the latest news. Like, none of that has happened. I've not been motivated to do that. I'm a bit, ambivalent about the film. I think at heart, it's a good talking point because it has a very controversial big message, which is that we don't change. None of the characters go through a path of personal development, nor is there a sort of decline and fall. So, McAllister for me starts off bad and ends up bad. It's not even that there's that sort of tragic arc of decline. From what I've heard of, the team behind the film say in interviews and so on, I think that's absolutely their view of humanity, that we are always who we really are, and who you really are doesn't change in your life. That's, a point of view that some people have, that you are who you are. But to me, that's a really pessimistic and depressing and wrong, which is that people can change, often for the better through their lives, sometimes sadly for the worse, but that really is counter to the basic message of the film. But that's absolutely why I can imagine sitting down with other people watching the film or going to the cinema and watching it, and then you can have great fun talking about it while eating pizza afterwards. So I don't like the characters. I don't like the moral of the film. I do give it a little bit of a saving grace that clearly the sort of side moral of the film is that preferential voting is better than first past the post, because that gets rid of all of the spoiler candidate nonsense stuff. I have enjoyed thinking about it and talking about it. So overall, on this bonkers scale that I suggested of scoring every film from 0 to 650 in homage to the size of the House of Commons, I think I'm going to give it a 390.
A solid Commons majority for election from Mark. Out of interest, if this was run under the alternative vote system, who would have won, do you think?
Ooh, good question. So
if you want to get in touch with us on social media, and if you found this podcast, you probably can, if you want to let us know who you think would have won under an AV election, because everyone knows, don't they, Mark, that surveys of hypothetical elections are always the most accurate forms of polling.
Absolutely. Particularly surveys of hypothetical elections where the participants are several decades too late to vote and in the wrong continent.
And fictional. So I look forward to the Weekend...
Minor detail.
I look forward to the Weekend Polls newsletter in which you examine this phenomenon.
What did you make of the film?
I enjoyed it. As Mark Kermode would say, for me, it passed the 6 laugh test. The one caveat similar to yours is there's much more weird sex than I remember. So on iPlayer at the moment, it's relatively short. So it's a good evening after work film that you can fit in. But it's probably not one to watch. If your aunt is coming over and you don't want to watch films that feature weird sex scenes, do not watch it with them. As you say, watch it with mates over pizza. I think it's a really interesting film with a lot to say, but for me, it's a bit too cynical about the politics of the 1990s and about career politicians and the way that it obviously sets up Tracy as a monster, which I think is quite harsh, and the way in which it likes the burn it down candidate. And I feel like if one of the issues we've got now is that people feel happy to vote for burn it down candidates because, hey, what's the worst that can happen? It's films like this one that have probably contributed to that. And in the trailer, the trailer starts with something that isn't an image not in the film, which is if you're one of the millions of Americans who still believe that honesty, integrity and fidelity are the cornerstones of our democracy, we suggest you wait for another preview before getting your popcorn. Now, I realise on one level you could say, Cory, you're being a typical centrist idiot, and this film comes out in 1999. What exactly happens in 2000, Cory? And you're going to try and say that this film is not, is too cynical about American democracy. And fair point. But I suppose looking at this now in the Trump era, it's helped create a cynicism about career politicians and the political process, which I think is kind of profoundly unhelpful. And it's a very interesting film. It's a really well-made film. It is a funny film that, again, all those reservations aside, I'd probably give this film between 420 and 450, I think, out of 650. So I'm probably more tolerant of unsympathetic characters and more forgiving of dodgy sex scenes than you are.
Let's not speculate what that tells us about our relative experiences of colleagues in each of our political parties.
Let's not do that, though. What's our plan for 2 weeks' time?
So next time we're going for a play called This House, which handily is also available to watch online as part of the National Theatre's Watch at Home programme. So if you missed it when it was on in the theatre, that doesn't matter. You can still watch it online or hopefully be inspired by our discussion of it and go and watch it online afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's about £8. I think you can rent it for a couple of days. I know Mark's particularly excited about this because he gets to talk about actual liberal politicians for the first time in this podcast. Book out your Thursday evening. It might be a long one.
Hopefully you've enjoyed hearing us talk about election. Hopefully you're looking forward to hearing us talk about This House. And if you have enjoyed this episode, please do tell others about it and give us a rating or review in your favourite podcast app.
Thanks for listening.